It may not look like it, but the city of Utica in New York State was once one of the most important industrial centers in the country. Today, its former textile factories stand idle. When the factories closed, residents looked elsewhere for work. Families moved away, and many buildings were abandoned. At one point, the National Guard had to be called in to demolish unsafe structures. Over the course of this decline, the city's population plunged from 120,000 to just 65,000 today. Utica has always been a town of immigrants. Germans, Poles, and Italians were responsible for the city's first wave of prosperity. Now another group from countries as distant as Vietnam, Somalia, and Bosnia is shaping Utica's future. Despite their very different backgrounds, these new arrivals all share a common experience. They're refugees, forced to flee their homes in the face of violence and persecution. Like this Bantu woman from the East African country of Somalia, nearly 1 out of every 6 Utica residents is a refugee, and city officials say they're reversing the town's decline. Bosnian families fleeing the war which devastated their country in the 1990s were amongst the first to arrive in Utica. They've since been joined by people escaping violence and persecution from across the globe. Utica's main street is a cluster of Russian corner stores, Bosnian hairdressing salons, and Vietnamese restaurants. Jeva Djarovic named his small grocery store and coffee shop after his daughter Amy when he opened a couple of years ago. Utica's Bosnian community has been credited with saving once derelict neighborhoods by buying and restoring abandoned houses. This young girl enjoys a typical American childhood in Utica, but a decade ago her father was a prisoner of war during the Bosnian conflict. He was regularly beaten by his guards and saw one of his fellow inmates die as a result of his treatment. Loy Hong escaped from Vietnam by boat when he was just a teenager. Today he works as a dealer at a nearby casino. Utica has been a destination for those forced to abandon their homes since 1975, when a group of clergy decided to resettle refugees. Their first project was a modest one, helping one Vietnamese man escape the aftermath of war. The Bantu from Somalia are among Utica's most recent arrivals. Hassan Mariti and his family fled the country's civil war in the early 1990s by walking for more than a week to Kenya. Some in the group died of thirst along the way. The Bantu are descendants of African slaves used by Arab traders during the 19th century. All of Hassan's children now speak English, and despite the extreme cultural differences, are at ease in an environment that once seemed very strange. 3 years ago, the U.S. government began resettling the Somali Bantus to cities across the country. In addition to Utica, many ended up in places such as Salt Lake City, Denver, and Tucson. Ong Tin Mo was a student activist against the military government in Myanmar, also known as Burma, and was forced to flee into the jungle. There he met and married his wife and witnessed the birth of his 2 children in the simple bamboo hut that was the family's home. This girl's family also came to the United States from Myanmar. It's not just the refugees that have had to get used to change. Utica itself has had to adapt to the arrival of people of different cultures, faiths, and traditions. The Brutsky family arrived in Utica from Belarus in the former Soviet Union, where they were persecuted because they belonged to the Pentecostal Church. For 12 years, 41-year-old Pavel tried to escape. When he was finally allowed to leave, he had to give up his passport and pay a fine. "It didn't matter where we ended up," said Pavel. Still, when they arrived in Utica, the family was shocked at the condition of their new home. Several months later, Pavel saw his sister shot in what was then a still lawless part of the city. Utica's Pentecostal community is now large and vibrant. They recently completed construction of their own church, with seating for 1,200 worshippers. Still, nearly every service is standing room only. In a local barber shop, 60-year-old Yuso Makovic finishes with a customer. Like many here, he came to Utica after fleeing the Balkan Wars. A sign on the barbershop wall announces that Utica is a haven for Bosnians, a sentiment that sums up the community's feelings. Utica has been good to refugees, but the refugees have also been good for the city. They've been credited with turning around the city's fortunes. At a recently rebuilt factory, more than half of the employees are refugees. Up to 4 members of some families work at the plant. Bob O'Reilly, ConMed's Director of Human Resources, calls it a win-win situation. It's good for the refugees, and it's good for us, he says. In fact, the company wouldn't be here without them. The Refugee Resources Center is one of the liveliest places in town. Its corridors are packed with people from around the world, dressed in everything from Buddhist robes to heavy overcoats to keep out Utica's freezing winter temperatures. The center provides a range of services to help refugees settle into their new home. Many refugees arrive here with no knowledge of English. The center also helps people to find a job, an apartment, or a school for their children. But the center doesn't just help refugees. It also advises local schools, hospitals, and community groups on how they can best help the often overwhelmed new arrivals. Building bridges is how the center's director describes it. In one of the refugee center's computer classes, a Somali Bantu woman comes to terms with a complex new world. Each year, the U.S. government establishes how many refugees will be accepted into the country and then works with state officials and refugee organizations to decide where they'll be resettled. The UN Refugee Agency cares for some 21 million displaced people around the world. For most, their first choice is to return home. Others start new lives in those countries where they originally sought safety. In 2005, just 100,000 refugees were resettled to more distant lands, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and Great Britain. Every year, the United States resettles more refugees than all other countries combined. In fact, 1 American in every 100 is a former refugee. It's perhaps the Somali Bantu who have faced the greatest challenges in adjusting to their new lives. Most of those obstacles have been overcome. But when you're from a country where temperatures are normally well over 100 degrees, the bitter cold of a Utica winter can seem overwhelming. Sometimes adapting to new conditions can be as simple as dressing for the occasion, but the success of Utica's refugee program hasn't been without problems. House prices have gone up, making it harder for new arrivals to find affordable accommodation. Financial resources are tight, but the city's mayor rejects suggestions that Utica has accepted all the refugees it can. On the contrary, says Mayor Tim Julian, we look forward to welcoming more. Sinat Butt and his wife survived Cambodia's killing fields and say the Hollywood movie of that name underplayed the savage butchery of a time when nearly an entire population was uprooted and murdered. While their arrival in Utica has been disorienting for many of the refugees, resilience and the ability to adapt are strengths shared by all, including Utica itself.